Hello and welcome to the fifth video in this Learning DAX series where we're trying to help people come up the learning curve for DAX much faster and talking through each of these key DAX concepts that Marco Russo previously listed as the key concepts to understand on your way to mastering DAX. In this one we'll talk about the expanded table concept. Hopefully you've already watched the first four videos where we described the sort of scenario we're working through where a coworker built a data model, but then you needed to do all the DAX calculations on it. We looked at the model, we saw what we could do without writing any DAX at all, and then we covered the concepts of row context and filter context. In the last video we talked about context transition, where we can convert a row context into a filter context, and that has many useful applications and something you need to understand. And then in this one we're going to talk about the concept of an expanded table. And this one's kind of a little different. The expanded table can be a confusing topic to folks, and it's really something to understand of how a data model behaves. And this is actually something you want to understand because most of the time you're going to try to avoid it if you can, right? But there are a couple situations where you may want to leverage it to get a different type of calculation. And the example I'll show today is how you can make a filter flow uphill, basically. So let's go ahead and do this one measure, but we're going to do it two ways. So let's start with a table visual, and we will just add our year month column as usual. And let's write a new measure. And so the first way we're going to do this is just using context transition that we learned about before. And we want to get the count of categories that had sales in any given month. So we'll just do the category count with sales. And so what we'll do in this one is we'll just do a count rows, the values of category, and because again we have the remember on the filter context video we talked about thinking about the table you start with and the table you need to turn it into. In this case, the date column doesn't filter the product category, so this is actually going to give us the list of all three product categories. But kind of like we did in one of the examples for context transition, we're going to say basically, not is blank, and then we're going to go ahead and calculate the total sales measure. And because we reference it as a measure, it's going to, we needed to filter our values of product category to where the calculation of total sales is not blank, right? So that'll give us categories, right? So we'll start with our list of three categories on each row, and then it'll get filtered by whether or not this is true, that there was not blank sales. Okay, and so we need one more parentheses here, and we will add that to our visual, and we'll see for a while we were only selling two categories, and then eventually we add in the third, right? So this is a real simple model, so the numbers aren't too exciting, but the concepts apply whether it's a small model or a big model. Okay, so this is the count of category with sales. We made a virtual table of the product category values, and then used context transition when we invoked the measure form of total sales which then took the row context of the category we're on, converted it into a filter context for that category through the product column into the sales table, and then did the total sales to see if it was blank or not. And so if it wasn't blank, that returned true, and therefore that was kept in the table didn't get excluded by the filter, and then we simply counted the rows of that. Okay, so let's talk about how we would do this measure with the expanded table. So before we do that, let's talk about what the expanded table is. So the expanded table concept is basically has to do with these kind of relationships. And so if we go over to the query editor, I actually sort of made the expanded table in this query called sales expanded. And we'll load this table to see how it behaves. But basically what this is this is the expanded table of the sales table. And because the sales table has these two relationships, with one with date and one with product, it actually, the way this model behaves, whenever we do calculations on the sales table, it actually is as if we had one giant table, which wouldn't be very efficient to store, but had left outer joins with both of the tables that connect to it. So in this case, I'm doing a left outer join from the sales table to the date table on the column that sale date and date where we have the relationship. And then just after that, I'm doing a second one with the product. So we get lots of rows here when we do this. And if I go ahead and recheck enable load on this and close and apply, we'll see that we get a new table added to our model. Fortunately, this is a really small model, so that happens fast. And if we scroll to the right here, we see that this sales expanded table is now there. Okay, and if we look in the data view, we can see what that looks like. And again, you would never really need to load this table to your model, but it is a way to look at this, sort of understand how data models expand. And this only applies when you're doing calculations on the sales table, because it's the one on the many side of a one-to-many. And so any table where that's the case, it does expand into along the many-to-one line to sort of bring in those left outer joins on those things. So the date table on its own there's not the expanded version of date table is only the date table. It doesn't include the other tables. Same thing with the product. It doesn't have a many-to-one relationship with any other table. So its expanded table is that. So if I do calculations that include just the date table or calculations that just include the product table, we don't have to worry about this. It's only when we invoke the sales table in its the physical table of the sales table into a calculation that we end up seeing the behavior here. Okay, so if I go and, for example, define the year-month column here, and if I look for January 2018 and filter that, and then I go and look for the column in the product table for, actually no, if you look, there's only the two values there, category 1 and 2. And if you look here, there's only two filtered distinct values. And if you remember, for our visual, we have a result of 2 for that other measure. And so that's consistent with what we're seeing here. So that's kind of how this is behaving. So now if we want to write a measure that takes advantage of the expanded table, we can do that as follows. So if I say new measure, and we'll just put expanded table on there. What we can do is say we want to calculate the count of, well, actually we want to we'll do count rows of the values of category. Okay, sorry, product category column. And so if let's remove the calculate first. Of course, if we just do this, right, what we're going to get is a value of 3 in every row, right? Because the date table is not filtering the sales table, and so we get a value of 3, right? So how do we take advantage of the expanded table? And so that we would do as follows, where we put this in a calculate, and then we're saying, hey, remember in our filters, tables are filters in our calculate expression. So all I'm going to do is put the sales table here. Okay, and I'm not going to reference one of the columns in the sales table. I'm just going to reference the sales table itself, and that's enough to invoke the expanded table. And so now this calculation will behave as if the calculation was occurring in that expanded table that I showed you, and not and we won't get the value of 3 anymore. Okay, and so now if we compare to our approach we used with context transition, right, you'll see that we get the same results, that eventually once we bring in that third category, we get that. So again, this is not an approach that is used very often, although it does come in handy because effectively we've made the filter kind of flow uphill because we're leveraging the expanded table. This is something that you really would typically avoid, and so the way you would avoid that is to not reference your physical tables out here in your calculate expression. So you've noticed with all the other ones, we typically just write single column expressions, right? Even if it's like with an all or other expressions, we would just have something that is only talking about a single column and not the whole table. So when you write it like this, the expanded table effect would kick in. Also if we did, filter sales where the quantity, was greater than 1, that would also show this behavior that we're talking about. So again, you should avoid referencing your physical tables in your tables filters part of your calculate expressions, unless you're invoking the expanded table knowingly to get a different kind of result. Okay, so it's a confusing concept. I encourage you to maybe play with it, or consider that, if you need to make a table flow uphill, consider, hey, maybe I do want to take advantage of the expanded table. Otherwise, I'm going to try to avoid it. All right.